Good morning, everyone, and thanks for joining us here today. I'm Jeff Ramsey, and I'm a senior fellow on Venezuela and Colombia here at the Adrian Arsht Latin American Center of the Atlantic Council. We at the Atlantic Council are dedicated to highlighting the urgency of the situation inside Venezuela and to finding innovative ways to open democratic space. We're committed to supporting a peaceful, democratic, but ultimately a just solution to the crisis in Venezuela. Working for this solution requires us to recognize reality. As we all know, the truth is that it's impossible to talk about Venezuela without talking about authoritarianism, human rights violations, and repression. In 2021, the Maduro regime became the first government in the Americas to be actively investigated by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. Those crimes include arbitrary imprisonment, sexual violence, torture, and persecution on political grounds. In recent years, the international community has tried to strike a balance between pressure and engagement in the hope of promoting a solution in Venezuela via free and fair elections. This is a pragmatic approach that recognizes changes in the international landscape, as well as Venezuelans' desire for an electoral path forward. However, Venezuela policy shouldn't forget the human rights reality inside the country. Let's remember that this reality, these injustices, affect real people and real lives. This is not an abstract concept or some kind of false narrative. Today, we're fortunate enough to have with us two courageous people who've experienced repression in Venezuela firsthand. Here with us in person is Matthew Heath, former U.S. Marine, as well as a former wrongfully detained American who was held captive by the Venezuelan regime for 2 years before his release last October. We're also joined online by Victor Navarro. Victor is a Venezuelan journalist who was also arbitrarily detained in Venezuela for 5 months and after his release in 2018 has worked to document the human rights situation in Venezuela via virtual reality. Victor spent time in El Helicoide, Venezuela's most notorious detention center, which has become a symbol of the human rights abuses and international crimes being committed in Venezuela today. I want to thank both Victor and Matthew for being with us here today, as well as for their courage and their resilience in being willing to talk about these issues. Matthew and Victor, no one should have to go through what you both have had to go through. Thank you for being with us here today. You'll also be joined by Tamara Tarasiuk, a leading human rights expert who is the Peter D. Bell Rule of Law Fellow at the Inter-American Dialogue, who can provide some context on human rights conditions inside Venezuela. And to moderate this incredible panel, I'm pleased to turn the floor over to Carrie Filippetti, who's the Executive Director of the Vandenberg Coalition, as well as the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Venezuela and Cuba. And I'm also proud to say the co-chair of the Atlantic Council's Venezuela Working Group. Before I do that, though, I just want to say a couple housekeeping items. We are hoping to have a Q&A with our panelists. So those of you that are here with us in the audience, we'll have a mic stand set up over there. And for those of you that are tuning in online, we ask that you submit your questions to askac.org. That's askac.org. You can submit your questions to the panelists through the app online. Carrie, thanks so much for agreeing to moderate this discussion of the human rights situation in Venezuela today.
Thanks very much, Jeff, and to the Atlantic Council for hosting this important event. I'm just going to ask a few questions because I'm sure you all have a lot that are pressing on your minds. But I really appreciate the opportunity to focus on those who have experienced firsthand the abuse of the Maduro regime, particularly in an environment where it seems many people are losing sight of exactly what's going on in Venezuela. So thank you so much to everybody for joining us. Tamara, I want to start with you before we hear from Victor and Matthew. Could you give us an overview of the human rights situation in Venezuela and how the regime uses wrongfully detained individuals for political purposes? I know that, as Jeff mentioned, there's a UN fact-finding mission and the International Criminal Court that has documented abuses. What can you share with us about all of that?
Thank you, Carrie, and thank you to the Atlantic Council for the invitation. I think it's very important to be having this conversation because today there's a false appearance of normalization about what is happening in Venezuela. It's partly due because of the dollarization of the economy, partly because of normalization of diplomatic relations with the Maduro government. But the truth is that the human rights situation is very far from normal. Venezuela is a country where we can see three simultaneous crises. There's a crackdown on dissent. We no longer see massive protests on the streets and people getting killed like in 2014 or 2017, but there is targeted repression. The humanitarian situation is still very dire. There are no longer the long lines of people waiting to get access to basic food or medicines. But what is available today is very expensive for most people. Inequality has deepened, and the situation in Caracas is very different from the situation in the interior of the country. And thirdly, there's a refugee crisis. More than 7.2 million Venezuelans have fled. More people are leaving than those that are coming back. And when they do leave, they have to go through all sorts of problems during their journey in host countries to be able to redo their lives outside of Venezuela. In terms of the crackdown, I think that it's important to highlight, Jeff was talking about the ICC prosecutor's decision. The situation of Venezuela is the only case of Latin America in which the ICC prosecutor has decided to open a formal investigation. And that's because of the magnitude of the abuses. There's evidence of crimes against humanity, and because Venezuelan authorities have been incapable of providing meaningful accountability for these crimes. These are not isolated cases committed by rogue agents. There's a systematic nature to the abuses that is the reason why the ICC prosecutor has decided to move ahead. And I will say, one of the most serious crimes that I have documented in my professional career is torture against political detainees. And it has been used in the case of Venezuela, both to punish dissent or to obtain information from detainees. And I'll let the other panelists talk about what actually happened if they feel like doing so. But I have to say, this is one of the most cruel things that I've documented in my entire professional career. And I will just finish by saying that it's not a coincidence that the prosecutor's decision came after very strong reports by independent experts appointed by the United Nations Human Rights Council in Geneva to what was called the fact-finding mission on Venezuela. And these experts have found three very important things that I think set the stage for this conversation. First, evidence of egregious abuses. Second, chain of command responsibility. And third, complicity by the Venezuelan judiciary in these crimes.
I want to turn towards the two individuals now who have experienced firsthand some of the things that Tamara just referenced. But before we get into your treatment, I want to get into you both as people, because obviously, the Atlantic Council and I care deeply about, the reason why we're involved in Venezuela is because of the human costs and consequences. So starting with you, Matthew, I want to kind of get to know you a little bit as a person. So tell us a little bit about you, about your family, about what you were doing before you ever set foot in Venezuela.
Well, thank you, Carrie. Well, of course, I'm a veteran of the United States Marine Corps. One of the most important things in my life is I'm a father of a 13-year-old son. He's the most important thing in my life. I'm a brother, I'm a son. And what was I doing in Venezuela? I was traveling. I'm a sailor. I love the ocean. I love nature. I love everything about the Caribbean. I've traveled extensively through the Caribbean. I love new cultures. I love traveling to places that are a little off the beaten path. And
even now?
99% of the time that works out really well, and sometimes it doesn't work out so well.
All right. Victor, sort of similar question for you. So you were a journalist in Venezuela. This is what caused your detention. Tell us a little bit about your life, the kind of reporting that you were doing, and why it was so important to you to do that, despite the fact of knowing that the regime would target you for it.
Yeah, the truth is that he arrested me for doing a social work. Although it is true that I am a journalist and my degree project was about the country's crisis through journalist report. The reason I was arbitrarily detained for 5 months is because they were working with street junks, and before that I was in organization empowered young in vulnerable areas. However, it's a very good question, because it should be noted that in Venezuela, both journalists and civil society organizations are victims of the regime. It is key because political prisoners are not only members of political parties. In Venezuela, there is a state policy against all of society. That state policy is a torture. Journalists are victims of the closure of information channels. The government takes away your equipment, and many journalists have been detained and tortured for the fact of reporting. Journalists are directly affected by waiting to report on the complex humanitarian crisis that the country is experiencing on crimes against humanity. But organizations too are prosecuting for documentary human rights violations. However, it's important to know that in Venezuela, anyone who thinks differently and speaks out against the regime can be tortured. Right now, we're talking about journalists, but I know dancers, social teachers, English teachers, minors, among others, and is that in Venezuela torture is a state policy. The most important thing is that this continues happen with journalists, with social workers. The Nicolas Maduro regime does it to silence anyone who thinks differently or wants to denounce the truth.
Matthew, during your 2-year detention, part of how your case was so elevated to the U.S. government was because of these notes that you were able to sneak out of the prison. They gave the U.S. government a sense of the conditions that you were in, as well as sort of your own personal resilience. I remember some of them had smiley faces on them, which I know that your family really appreciated. I'm curious, under the conditions that you were in, how were you able to sneak these notes out, and why was it so important to you to communicate that, knowing that there was a potential cost to you for doing so?
Well, Carrie, I can't specifically go into the details of how I smuggled my notes out, because the people that helped me smuggle those notes, they're still in Venezuela. And if I talked about that today, they would immediately be thrown in prison. They would be in prison tonight. However, I can say that the first 10 months of my detainment, I wasn't allowed any communication. I wasn't allowed to receive any communication whatsoever. And personally, that was very difficult. I'm not a lawyer. I can't cite the specific laws that that's a violation of, but it's certainly a violation of international norms for the human rights and the treatment of prisoners. It's injustice, and that's something that we see. It's very common in Venezuela, is injustice.
And did you ever receive communications back?
After 10 months, there was some sporadic communication. I received letters 2 or 3 times in my 2 years, very infrequently. Because my family didn't speak Spanish, they didn't send me letters in Spanish, so it was very difficult for me to receive letters in English. The prison would receive them and throw them away, or they would keep them in investigations, but they wouldn't give them to me. I was able to start making phone calls after a lot of personal struggle with the staff. And then after about a year, the administration of the prison changed from the DGCIM, which is the military counterintelligence. They took a step back. They didn't take their hands completely off the prison, but after about a year, the Ministry of Prisons, the Bureau of Prisons version in Venezuela, they came in and they had a big part of the administration there. So after they came in, the prisoners were allowed to make phone calls at least once or twice a week, which was really that's a really big thing, because when you're in another country and your entire family is separated from you, you're isolated, and that's the most important thing for me is my family. So being able to make those phone calls was very important.
Yeah, I can only imagine. Were you ever able to speak to your son during those 2 years?
Yes. However, I was very reluctant. I was very reluctant to make phone calls to my son from the prison, because it's very normal for there to be intimidation, threats against your family, mm-hmm. and that wasn't something that I wanted to involve my small son in.
Sure. Victor, you were in one of Venezuela's most notorious prisons, Helicoide, which is notorious for its brutal treatment of prisoners. But there's so much we still don't understand about it. What do you think is most important for people to know about what goes on inside that prison?
I think the most important thing is to say that El Helicoide is a torture center. Yeah, that in Venezuela there are clandestine and torture centers. There are no ordinary prisons or with normal operations. There are centers where the political police, responding to direct orders from Nicolás Maduro, systematical torture, civilians, and soldiers. I think the most important thing is to say that this continues to happen, that the people who are there are in the worst condition. For me, the Helicoide represents the true face of the Chavismo and Madurismo. People have to know that even in the place, people are electrocuted, drowned, suffocated, killed in El Helicoide, inside El Helicoide. Many are not allowed to see the sun, have a lawyer, or a visit from a family members. The most important thing they have to know is that within the spiral structure, the Chavismo and Madurismo commit the gross atrocities against the populations. We are with my team in my work. We create a virtual experience when you can see is El Helicoide inside. We have a video. When you can put, if you want, for show how is El Helicoide inside, yeah.
Yeah, we do have that video, so we'll put that on so folks can get a sense of what this virtual reality does.
Yo creo que hay un momento donde pierdes la sensibilidad, porque hay un momento donde dejas de sentir los golpes. Yo ya no tenía miedo a morirme, porque era mejor. ¿Qué pasa cuando no te alimentan, cuando no tienes agua, cuando no tienes a tu familia, cuando no ves el sol, cuando no tienes a tu abogado, cuando te mienten que vas a salir y no, es mentira? Tienes sarna en el cuerpo, tienes escabiosis en todo el cuerpo, en la cabeza, en los pies, cuando te cagas encima. ¿Te quieres morir?
En este espacio se encuentran los gritos de libertad, los caídos durante las protestas, los desterrados en el exilio y los familiares que pierden a sus hijos.
Que esto no quede así nada más.
Es el centro de torturas más grande de Venezuela, recreado en una experiencia virtual. Es el ciclo histórico que se tiene que romper, los barrotes que se deben destruir. Es el reconocimiento a los que no se rinden, a los que no se detienen. Es la búsqueda de libertad que quedó en la herida de un perdigón, en el exilio o en la tumba. Es la memoria. Tenemos prohibido olvidar.
So I'm happy to note that for those who are in the audience right now, you'll have an opportunity after this conversation to experience that virtual reality here in person. So thank you so much, Victor, for doing that. Knowledge is one of the best ways to bring people out of the darkness. Just out of curiosity, if for those viewers who are watching remotely, if they happen to have an Oculus Rift, is there a way for them to access this experience themselves?
Yeah, the experience is about the different places inside El Helicoide. We created with the 20 testimonies of the different victims, women and men that were inside El Helicoide. since 2014 today.
So if someone has an Oculus, what are the, I don't know, I've never used an Oculus, I have to admit to the audience, so I don't know if this is a stupid question. How does one, like, if I had an Oculus, how would I access this? Do I like,
Yeah, if you have Oculus with the platform for the website, you can access with the link and download the experience in Oculus.
Okay, great. So maybe if we can get folks from the Atlantic Council to put that link into, for viewers at home who happen to have this technology. Tamara, I want to go to you because you helped kind of set the stage for what's going on in Venezuela and how the regime uses detention and torture to further its own political objectives. Obviously, we're in the midst of ongoing negotiations as well. The United States is trying to push forward a political settlement between the opposition and the Venezuelan regime. So I just wonder, how does all of this fit into that negotiation process? And what role do you think continued human rights violations like the one we're describing today will play into whether or not an agreement is reached between the opposition and the regime?
Look, I think it's important to note that people have a short attention span. And when certain topics don't make headlines, they're easily forgotten. So, there may easily be a temptation by those who are currently engaging with the Maduro government to look forward and sweep all of this under the rug, precisely because there are no massive protests or people getting killed on the streets. With no blood, there are no headlines. And I think it's important to note that that's terribly short-sighted. History shows that Venezuelan authorities don't make concessions voluntarily. They only do that if they have the proper incentives. An obvious incentive is lifting and imposing sanctions. But I do think we need to see accountability for serious abuses like the ones we've been talking about as an incentive as well. Because obviously no one wants to go to prison. First I would say there are obviously certain red lines provided by international law that you can't cross. You can't give an amnesty for crimes against humanity. But a transition to democracy in Venezuela requires a serious conversation about who needs to go to jail and for which crimes. And this includes not only human rights abuses, but also corruption. And it's very important to have a model for transition to something closer to a democracy in Venezuela. And that's what we all want. But that model inevitably will have this component. And this has to be a model that's unique for Venezuela. Venezuela is not the military dictatorships of the Southern Cone in the 70s and 80s. It's not Colombia's armed conflict, and it's not the wars in Central America. It's its own thing, and it requires a model that will provide justice, but that also generates those incentives for those in power to be willing to have this conversation. So just as a final thought on this, I think it's very important, or at least this is what I believe, engaging with Maduro is not a problem in and of itself. The question is, what will governments that are engaging with the current Venezuelan authorities talk about when they are engaging with them? And that conversation needs to be based on an accurate diagnosis of what is happening in the country. And second, it needs to have an accountability component as a key part of that engagement.
Great. Matthew, you spoke a little bit about your time in the prison itself. So I want to fast forward to when you found out that you were getting released. When did you find out? Did you know the context behind it? Did you know that you were part of a prisoner swap program? I mean, talk us through that first day that you learned that you were going to be released.
Well, I was detained a little over 2 years, and there's a whole process where you're always thinking you're going to go free. It's this next thing, it's this next thing, and then eventually, for me, you just become accustomed to being there, and you're not really thinking about the future. You're just, well, I'm in prison today. I didn't know until 6 a.m. the day of my release. I was woken up by the deputy director of the prison, and I didn't believe them at first, because the DGCIM, the military counterintelligence in Venezuela, they're awful people. They're practiced liars, and I just thought that it was an attempt to manipulate me. Perhaps it was part of a new interrogation. And after several other prisoners were brought in to see me, and they convinced me, no, Matthew, you're leaving right now. You need to get your stuff ready. So it was an extremely surprising day. I started at 6 a.m. and I ended the day in San Antonio. So wow. that was the rebirth of my life.
Can you share that first moment of sort of landing back in the United States, landing back in a free country? I mean, you're a Marine, you put your life on the line beforehand to protect this country. What was that feeling like and seeing your family for the first time?
Well, it was absolutely incredible. Presidential Envoy for Hostage Affairs, Roger Carstens, Ambassador Roger Carstens was on the flight. There were 7 of us that came back, and he gave us a message from President Biden welcoming us to our return to the United States. He wanted to be the first one that welcomed us once we landed on U.S. soil. It was absolutely incredible. We were in a big hangar with a giant American flag and all the families, and it's something that I will remember for the rest of my life.
And Victor, your release was a little bit different. I think probably much less fanfare than Matthew's received. Can you walk us through, your release, what that meant, and then, your subsequent decisions for you and your family about where to live and how to, survive post imprisonment? You're still muted, I think.
Sorry, can you repeat?
Yes, sorry. I was just saying, walk us through your release. When you left prison, what were you experiencing? How did you find out you were going to be released? And then, what are the things that you had to decide, leaving Venezuela, for example, to keep yourself and your family safe?
I think is so complicated to explain the experience because change your life. I absolutely, because one leave the prison, the building structures, there are more smaller. For me, the rain have another dimension, another mean. Yeah, the after prison, your life changes absolutely. Your responsibility with the country changes. The more important is not the protest after prison. The more important is justice. Is say the truth and promote the no repetition. In Helicoide, I understood the Chavismo of dimension. I believe the responsibility after prison with this experience is necessary. Say that the truth is very hard. It's very hard. The relationship with another people, because my friends see me differently after prison. However, I consider that this experience changed my life. But my rule in this moment is create a memory and denounce for justice, for truth, for no repetition, and for for another victims that in this moment for different reasons are in silence.
I think what I find most inspiring about both of you, not only your willingness to come here, but both of you have subsequently dedicated your time to sharing your stories, and not only sharing them, but also trying to fight for change. Victor, with your VR invention, as well as with your NGO, and then Matthew, I know you've been really active on Capitol Hill trying to fight for reform as well. So we really appreciate everything that you're doing to share your experiences and to hopefully help those who are in similar conditions. I want to turn to audience Q&A. So if you are online, as Jeff mentioned, you can still submit questions. So you can go to askac.org and submit your questions. And then we also have, for those folks who are in the studio audience, there's a microphone on, I guess, your left-hand side. I still have to do one of these, but we do have some questions that have already started to come in from the audience, so I'll ask those, and then if folks want to line up here, you can do so as well. This is, I think, for both of you. An anonymous questioner asks, what was your relationship with other political prisoners or wrongfully detained individuals? Were you able to communicate with them while you were there? Have you communicated since? And did you find support in one another? So you both probably had very different experiences on this. So maybe we'll start with you, Matthew.
Okay. Well, in the prison, in the DGCIM prison, all the prisoners there are political prisoners. There are a few Americans, and the majority are Venezuelans. Some of the best people in the world, some of the best military officers I've ever met in my entire life are political prisoners in Venezuela right now. Lieutenant Colonel Marin Chaparro is a Venezuelan tank armor officer. He's an incredible officer. He's there for simply publicly criticizing the Maduro regime, and he was one of my biggest supporters in the prison. He speaks many languages fluently. He helped me in the beginning of my process when I was learning to speak Spanish, and we were able to communicate. But there's always oppression. There's always, all the communications in the prisons are recorded, and they're monitored. You're not allowed to speak. You don't have freedom of expression. Any communications you have with anyone can be used against you to punish you. I mean, if you can't speak against the Maduro regime in the prison, or you'll be punished.
And Victor, were you able to speak with other prisoners? I mean, what was your experience like?
Yeah, all time I speak with another political prisoners. For me, the political prisoners are my new family. With speed with they is necessary for me, and connect with different realities and increase my respect, and this reason, I like it all time talking about the different things with another political prisoners, and I believe this connection is very hard for war with the for justice with another political prisoners.
Tamara, can you give us a little context? How many Venezuelan political prisoners are we sort of talking about that are currently in the system today?
Well, just to give you a few numbers, since 2014, when the repression intensified in Venezuela, there have been more than 15,000 people who were arbitrarily detained. And one of the characteristics of this is a revolving door. So it's, there's no fixed number because they go in and out. A very good source to figure out how many there are at a specific given time is El Foro Penal, which is an organization in Venezuela that provides judicial support to political prisoners in Venezuela. And they count, depending the exact number, but around 280 political prisoners at the moment.
Great. All right, so this is an interesting one from Andrea Peters. This is to you, Matthew. So we spoke a little bit about the phone calls that you were able to make finally after 10 months, or after about a year or so. Who was your first phone call to?
Well, I was really lucky that 3 people in my family who are not normally in the same place were all at the same place on my first phone call. And it was just dumb luck that my father, my mother, and my aunt were all visiting together. And I received a 10-minute phone call after about a 1-week hunger strike. So I went on a hunger strike to receive a phone call, and that was because it was the week of my son's birthday. Actually, it was my son's birthday. So I started a week ahead of time, and I didn't tell them what day it was, but it worked out that it was on my son's birthday. So it was really a miracle.
Another question, this one also anonymous to Tamara. From a human rights perspective, why and how do authoritarian regimes use detention for political gain? Wouldn't there be less sympathy from their supporters?
Well, I wish I knew what people who torture think when they're doing that, because as I said, it's one of the most cruel things that I've talked about and documented in my entire career. The torture is used for two reasons primarily. One is to punish people, and the other is to obtain information. As an investigative tool, it's a pretty lame one, because the truth is that when you're torturing someone, in the end, you don't really know what sort of information you're getting, because people feel compelled to provide information as a consequence of the torture, not necessarily truthful information. So it's not really a good way to investigate crimes. But that's, one of the main reasons why it's used. And in a system like Venezuela's, where the justice system is not independent, this is the information that is very typically used as evidence for arbitrary prosecutions against people in criminal processes without due process. So I think this is a system that works, torturing people to punish or to obtain information in a country where you don't have judicial independence, and the justice system doesn't investigate crimes, even less so human rights violations. And it is used as a tool to go after opponents and critics. And that's why the international angle of accountability is so important in a country like Venezuela. Because if you look at the way authorities have interacted with the International Criminal Court, for example, you'll see that they are very concerned about the actual possibility of a criminal prosecution that they can't control would move forward and provide accountability for crimes.
One of the things that I sort of alluded to was how each of you, and this is to include Tamara, have not only sort of dedicated yourselves to learning about what's going on, but also to fighting it and changing things. So before we close, I want to ask each of you about the various things that you're pushing for. Matthew, the policy changes you're pushing for on Capitol Hill. Victor, your NGO and what you're trying to achieve through that, and then Tamara, your human rights activism and work as well. So maybe let's start with Matthew. Talk to us a little bit about how your own personal experiences have affected the policy changes that you're currently pushing for here in Washington.
Well, Carrie, I have a two-pronged approach. Privately, I'm working with in the security industry, doing threat assessments and trying to help travelers to prevent this kind of thing from happening. Behind the scenes, as far as policy is concerned, it's a two-pronged approach. We need to resolve current cases like Austin Tice, who's been missing in Syria for over 10 years. Ahmad Shargi is one of the detainees in Iran with his family is involved with the Bring Our Families Home campaign. There's a large community of NGOs that I work with. The Diane Foley Foundation, Hostage US. There's some leaders in the Congress and the Senate who work behind the scenes. We're trying to modify the Foreign Sovereign Immunities Act, update it to reflect the reality of today, but broadly speaking, we don't just need to resolve the current cases. We need to prevent hostage diplomacy from occurring to, other citizens.
Victor, You've dedicated your life since being released from prison to promoting awareness of what's going on and creating your own nonprofit. Can you talk to us a little bit about what that means to you and what your organization is pushing for?
Yeah, I think I repeat. I think it's a responsibility for me. My initiative with Voces de la Memoria, that is my organization for victims of this project, the reality Helicoide, is so important for visibility to show the situation in my country. Principal is so important to say that is continue, that is happening now. It is a virtual reality experience that seeks to raise awareness about the situation of political prisoners in Venezuela. For me, the technology is a powerful tool for generating empathy and understanding. And this experience seeks to transport users to other ways in accessible place and give a peek into the life of a political prisoners in Venezuela. I was imprisoned in that torture center in Venezuela, in Helicoide. I think that it has been important for me to offer this experience to measure the reality of what is happening in there, but also to remind the world that this is still happening now, that this moment there are prisoner politicians in El Helicoide and another torture center, and that we cannot forget it. I also believe that offering this experience, more than important for me, was a responsibility. Telling a story transcending my personal story, because it is the story of the 3 victims in the virtual reality experience who are still waiting for justice. Was a task that we had to assume it with a great responsibility.
And Tamara, you've been in the human rights space for quite some time. What are the things that you think are most important in terms of, ways that we can get involved? We, either the United States government, we, citizens of various countries can get involved to try to prevent the kinds of abuses that we're seeing in Venezuela?
Look, I think in my case, the principal objective I have is contributing to getting Venezuela closer to a transition to something that's as close as we can to a democracy. That's going to take time, and it's not going to be easy, but it will only happen if, first, it's based on facts and not narratives, and second, if there are the right incentives. And it will be in phases, right? We need to create conditions for as free and as fair possible elections as we can. We need to be able to eventually restore the infrastructure in the country so that hospitals have water and electricity. We need to be able to overhaul the justice system. These are very broad objectives, but we won't get even close to any of that without a clear understanding about the facts and the reality on the ground. That's why I think having these sorts of conversations and remembering that there are torture victims and that justice is necessary, but that we need to be having this conversation strategically in a way that will get us closer to our longer term objectives is extremely important. So, to your last question, Carrie, to the audience and to governments and policymakers, I think the main recommendation is to look at the facts and start with that. And the facts in Venezuela indicate, as I said at the beginning, that the situation from a human rights perspective is very far from normal.
Tamara, thank you for that, and thank you to our panelists and to you to helping us understand those facts and to see those facts so that we can all continue to spread them and spread awareness of them. I would like to now turn over to Diego Arrea, who is the Deputy Director of the Adrian Arsht Latin America Center here at the Atlantic Council.
Thank you, Carrie, and hello, everyone, whether you have connected virtually or attended in person. As Carrie mentioned, I'm Diego Area, Deputy Director of the Latin America Center at the Atlantic Council. Today's discussion served to advocate for those who have suffered under the systematic abuses of the Maduro government. It amplified the voices of those who have been silenced by the power of the Venezuelan state, subjected to systematic violence, persecution, repression of dissent, and torture. Today's testimonies has also shed light on the thousands of voices that have been overshadowed by other global disruptions, such as COVID-19, Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the energy crisis, and other topics that dominate public attention nowadays. At the Atlantic Council, we are committed to providing a platform for those who have suffered under the grip of the Maduro government. This is not a narrative. These are thousands of personal stories of immense human suffering, and there are not political agendas that can overshadow the truth. They cannot cover the sun with a finger, and we are here today to make sure of that. I want to thank Carrie Filippetti for the continued leadership and support for our Venezuela work. I also want to take the opportunity to thank Matthew Heath, who traveled here to be the voice of those who have been unlawfully detained, and of course to Victor Navarro for his immense efforts advocating for the cause of justice, and to Tamara Herrera, to Tamara Tarasiuk for her amazing commitment to the Venezuela cause. Now I would like to invite our in-person participants to participate in an Oculus Rift demonstrations, Voices of the Memory, showcasing one of the worst and brutal, showcasing the brutality that goes on behind the walls of the Helicoide. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. Applause for